good friend of ours, talking about what a mess the church seemed to be in and how discouraging it can be. And I was reminded, I have children spread all over the country and have been to a lot of different services over the last 6 weeks or so. Don't be discouraged. I mean, the church as we know it and want it to be is extremely strong and growing. At least that's the impression I get. Beautiful First Friday Stations of the Cross at St. John Cantion's, full house. I was at a church over Easter in Virginia for traditional Latin Mass. In the pew next to me was a kid. He must have been 10 or 11 years old at the most. Had one of those monster Mass missals, and was flipping through it, finding and he was reading the Latin parts out loud. I mean, the part where the congregation was reciting it. In that Mass alone, there must have been literally 50 kids under 3 years old. And I don't mean this is, I'm not saying they all had huge families. I'm not saying that at all. It was just such a young, vibrant crowd. And whoever hears about this stuff, if all you do is, follow the media, the mainstream media, however you want to put it. In a way, I'm making a plug, as always, for the website, because you've got to keep up with our news and know that there are people out there pushing back against the bad stuff and doing vibrant things. And this is not a time to be discouraged at all. I think there's an expression, I always get it wrong, but steel strengthens steel, sharpens steel. Sharpens steel. We're steel sharpening steel. And we can only do it if we know what we're talking about. The speaker today, for example, is going to discuss canon law. Well, how many of us really know what canon law is or why it matters? And if someone comes up to you and says, what's this canon law stuff? That's not in the Bible. Do you have an answer? Are you prepared to talk about that in a helpful way? That's what we're trying to do. Trying to get people educated who are interested in being educated about our faith and then able to go out and talk to other people about it. So, another plug for the website. What's the website? CatholicCitizens.org. It's not real complicated. Okay? And I'm not saying you have to go to it every day or even once a week, but if you dip down, also we have a beautiful search engine on the site. If you're interested in a topic or perhaps a Vatican document or something you've read in the news, just put it in the search box. You'll probably find it on the site. So and I don't take a huge amount of credit for that. That was something we inherited from the Marianne regime. But it really has some wonderful features, and it's just a great place to stay on top of things. As I said, Father Finelli has not shown up. He was planning to, God willing. I doubt if God was unwilling. Something probably went wrong. Can I impose on you for a blessing before we start? Thank you.
We place ourselves in the presence of Almighty God and of our Blessed Lady. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Benedict Domino sit hectua Domino quaeditua largitate suum per Christum Domino nostrum. Amen. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts which we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. In Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Bon appetit. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. And it's been a pleasure to meet some of you so far. I hope to have a chance to meet and greet all of you at some point today. God bless you.
One of the joys we have of presenting Father Marcello is that he's someone I've never heard of before. And he's a young man, obviously, and incredibly well educated, and I think probably destined for great things. But we learned of him because we approached Peter Kwasniewski, who is a good friend of Catholic Citizens, and he recommended him. And I just wanted you all to know that we didn't just pull this guy out of nowhere. Professor Peter Kwasniewski very highly recommended him. He was going to try to come and give the talk himself, but had a conflict, and so that's how we got to know Father Marcello. Father Marcello is currently serving the church in several capacities in the Diocese of Providence, Rhode Island. He earned his B.A. double major in mathematics and philosophy and a minor in theology, summa cum laude, from Providence College. He earned his Bachelor of Sacred Theology, magna cum laude also, and his M.A. magna cum laude from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. He went on to get his Master of Society Law and Religion summa cum laude at Catholic University Leuven, Belgium, and he currently is a Doctor of Canon Law candidate. He's preparing to argue his thesis also at the Catholic University in Leuven. In addition to his extended published scholarly work, he is also fluent in Latin, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Italian. So, without further ado, please give a Catholic Citizens of Illinois welcome to Father Marcello.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very, very much, Mr. White, and thank you all very, very much for your very, very kind and very, very generous welcome today. This is my first visit to Chicago, and it's been a wonderful experience thus far. Very, very grateful to you all. Upon being invited, I was perhaps a bit bewildered as to why I would be asked to deliver such an address. I was, however, reminded of the old adage that's often heard in canon law circles. It says that if you have a license in canon law, it means that you know all the rules. If you have a doctorate in canon law, it means that you know all the exceptions. Being on my way to my doctoral defense, I suppose that means that I know at least maybe a few of the exceptions. As a canonist and as a priest, I'm reminded of the words of the great jurist of the University of Louvain, Father Gerard Franzen. Multa possent dicere de legibus. Many things can be said about laws. There exists certainly a hierarchical structure of laws according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the eternal law, and the subsets of that being the divine and natural law, and the subset of that being human and ecclesiastical laws. It's very easy to fall into confusion and error in speaking about law from a moral versus a juridical standpoint. In the understanding of St. Thomas Aquinas, laws are ordinances of reason and not so much of the will. With this in mind, it becomes rather simple to compare and contrast the legal approaches taken by Pope Benedict XVI and by Pope Francis in this most important matter of the Mass. We are not obliged to accept contradictions or the denial of doctrine or even of history upon which the ecclesiastical laws of the Church are rightly founded. The title of our lecture today, Three Strikes and You're Out, the curious case of the suppression of the traditional Mass, may perhaps sound somewhat cavalier to treat the holy sacrifice of the Mass under such common terms. But I think maybe it emphasizes a rather important reality in which the traditional Mass has been treated over many, many years. In many, many ways, the sacrifice of the Mass, according to the traditional rite of the Church, has been treated as a sort of legal scrimmage rather than as a theological, juridical reality. We'll continue with this in a little while. The words nunquam abrogatum should be very important to each and every one of us. This two-word statement from Pope Benedict XVI in Summorum Pontificum is and remains a very important legal datum. It's an important juridic fact now clearly established by the Supreme Legislator of the Universal Church. But we need to take a step back as well. At the University of Louvain, it was always emphasized to us to take a historical approach, particularly in looking at theology and canon law. It's important for us to retrace our path also in a way to discover a way forward. From at least a de facto standpoint, the praxis from the putatively mandatory introduction of the revised Roman Missal, made official on November 28, 1971, until the vacatio legis of Summorum Pontificum expired on September 14, 2007, was that, with few exceptions, the usage of the 1962 Missal required at least some form of special permission, either by a local ordinary religious superior or by the Holy See itself.
This question has a very deep historical significance, as this assertion of the non-abrogation of the 1962 Missale Romanum was affirmed by a commission of 9 cardinals in December of 1986. Many theologians from the 1970s until the 2000s, such as Count Neri Caponi, would make arguments for the impossibility of abrogation of quo primum during the 1970s, as well as 2 perhaps lesser-known theologians, Father Gomar Dupont, J.C.D, and Father Jean-Réal Blot, S.T.D. Father Gomar Dupont, who was one of the first advocates for preserving the traditional Mass during the 1960s, proposed an argument from custom based upon Canon 30 of the 1917 Code. He centers upon the concept of quo primum as a bilaterally binding contract involving the Church and the celebrant of the Roman Rite. He notes that even the 1974 notification authored by Annibale Bugnini could even revoke this custom. The argument by Father Jean-Réal Blot centers around a similar argument from custom, united with a theological argument for a non-abrogation relating to the liturgical rites of the faithful, as expressed by Dom Prosper Guéranger, OSB. He notes how Dom Guéranger explains how the citizens of Milan defended their Ambrosian rite, and how they opposed 2 abrogations which were decreed in true and proper form by the sovereign pontiffs Nicholas II and Eugene IV. Rome had no other choice but to accept their protestations, because they simply wished to pray according to the same prayers and rites as their fathers in the faith. This conference intends to speak of this non-abrogation as a juridic fact, because it has been established by the supreme legislator of the Catholic Church in Summorum Pontificum I. No matter how much verbiage may flow from certain people, nevertheless, this remains an historical fact. The main goal of our talk will not only be to speak about this, but also about some consequences which flow from this important fact in light of recent developments of the Holy See. First, I'd like to speak a little bit about the hermeneutics of this important topic. Subsequent to the promulgation of Summorum Pontificum, some authors such as John Baldwin, S.J., Antonio Sanchez Gil, and Chad Glendinning have all proposed theories on how this assertion should be properly understood. I hope to offer an overview of several different theories by canonical authors, how this legal datum could potentially be understood and interpreted, as well as a sort of critique of them as well. First, I'd like to start with 2 professors of canon law from the University of Ottawa, Chad Glendinning and John Hewells. Chad Glendinning takes a very strictly juridical approach to analyzing this question. He affirms that by making this statement, either Benedict XVI was either overturning his predecessors, namely Paul VI, and the praxis of the Roman Curia, or that the assertion itself is canonically imprecise. To this dilemma, one could respond as Glendinning himself even asserts in his writings, that Paul VI did the same thing in trying to overturn the decisions of his predecessors, as the pontiff himself is the supreme legislator. Glendinning seems to fall into that latter group, stating that it is an imprecise usage of canonical language. But Glendinning and John Hewell seem to affirm that the discipline surrounding the celebration of the 1962 liturgical text was abrogated because the 1917 Code had been abrogated. However, as Glendinning himself affirms, the legislation enacted in Summorum Pontificum is indeed something rather unprecedented. Benedict XVI reinvigorated a liturgical usage with a legal document. This legal document requires some comment and a system of legal supports. Thus, it would seem that the hermeneutics used to interpret the problem at hand, that of identifying and harmonizing these laws, should indeed have recourse to the mind of the legislator, as well as the existing legislation from the time when this liturgical form was in vigor. Taking a purely juridic view, I think, does not seem very helpful following this series of logic. Norbert Lüdecke, a German canonist, has also offered several different theories for how nunquam abrogatum, never abrogated, may be reconciled with the legislative act of Paul VI in issuing the Novus Ordo Missae, as well as with the historical record of the last 40 years or so. Citing Georg May, another canonist who was involved in the preservation of the traditional Mass, argues for the derogation of quo primum by Missale Romanum. Ludica refers to the historical fact that even since the promulgation of Missale Romanum by Paul VI, celebrations of the traditional Mass have never ceased. He goes on to propose several interpretations. Number one, that the subsequent approval of previously forbidden things in principle is proof that there should never have been an outright prohibition. This, he argues, would render the practice of derogation useless. He also says, secondly, that the Second Vatican Council immunized this liturgical form from reform in Sacrosanctum Concilium number 4, that all lawfully acknowledged rights are of equal right and dignity, that she wishes to preserve them in the future and to foster them in every way. Ludica does not appear to have passed judgment on this second interpretation, whether for or against. But also, he argues that the supreme legislator, as Dominus Canonum, the Lord of the Canons, could be asserting his primatial monopoly on interpretation in order to decree a historical version of continuity of papal actions, by only desiring to continue the normative shaping of the form never laid to rest, which was left undone by Paul VI and started by John Paul II. While Ludica offers this variety of explanations from a canonical viewpoint, it is also helpful to remember that besides his role as supreme legislator, Pope Benedict XVI also brought into such legislation a profound theological reflection on liturgical matters. This juridical and theological interpretation, which I think is perhaps the most convincing argument, I will discuss further in just a few short moments. This particular perspective has been explicated by Antonio Sanchez Gil of the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, Santa Croce in Rome. He argues that the language is not imprecise, but rather that it reflects a deeper theological understanding of whether one can juridically abrogate a text that beyond its accidental alterations has had such a role within the theological and liturgical tradition for more than 400 years, and really ultimately far longer to the earliest days of the patristic era of the Church. It would be akin to promulgating a new catechism or a new edition of the Bible, which would not abrogate the older one. Indeed, Sanchez Gil would term some of those other opinions which I just argued as a juridical positivist logic applied to liturgical law. This is something which is to be eschewed. In response, Shad Glendinning states that such a perspective would not allow for any liturgical uniformity. However, I think it can be said that it was debatable whether within the Western rites at least, there ever truly was, or even rather whether there ever should have been, a genuine liturgical uniformity. Dominic Letourneau's analysis on this point is very apposite. He says, and I quote, "The much decried uniformity was not as absolute as it appeared. The Congregation of Rites approved on November 28, 1947, a bilingual ritual for France, extended thereafter to non-French dioceses by indults. This ritual contained certain rites culled textually from the Roman ritual, but the decree did not contain any language suppressing the use of particular canonically legitimate rites which come from rituals in vigor or by customary law. The question is posed to know how the rites which did not conform to the Roman ritual could legitimately be in usage. The Roman ritual was promulgated by Pope Paul V on June 17, 1614. Contrary to what his predecessor, St. Pius V, did for the breviary and the missal, he did not make its usage obligatory, limiting himself to bishops and pastors to adopt it. In many cases, the adoption of the Roman ritual was accompanied by the approbation of the Congregation for Rites, a diocesan supplement leaving in effect, in vigor, a good number of rites coming from local ancient rituals. In a good number of cases, one finds rites practiced in parishes not conforming to the Roman ritual, which was officially in usage, but conforming to the prescriptions of ancient rituals of the dioceses which were always followed, rites which held consequently their legitimacy by custom. If I even may make so bold to cite the famous preface to the 1549 Anglican Book of Common Prayer, it is a historical record which likewise attests to this lack of strict uniformity within Catholic medieval England. It notes what the effects will be of the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in the worship of the Schismatic Church of England. It says that where heretofore there hath been great diversity in saying and singing in churches within this realm, some following the Salisbury use, some Hereford use, some the use of Bangor, some of York, and some of Lincoln, now from henceforth all the realms shall have but one use. End quote. It appears that a further clarification can be found in the writings of Father John Hunwick, a priest of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham. His insights are based upon a meta-canonical reading of Ratzinger's own text, really a recourse to the mens legislatoris by means of his theology. He notes that it is contrary to the spirit of the Church to abolish the rites which have served the piety and lives of generations of Christians. To this end, Father Hunwick offers evidence from St. Pius V about the adoption of the Roman Rite in 1570, particularly the preservation of rites which were in effect longer than 200 years. Looking back upon previous writings of Cardinal Ratzinger, he notes the theological value of the rites themselves beyond a simple canonical dispute over abrogation or non-abrogation. And I quote, "In 1999, Cardinal Ratzinger wrote, 'Rites are forms of the apostolic tradition and of its unfolding in the great places of the tradition. Cardinal Ratzinger's concerns are less with canon law than with an unwritten law inscribed in the very nature of the Church, the embodiment of the authentic tradition, which trumps the law embodied in transient canonical codes and enactments. What he is writing is theology, and his subject is the spirit-filled life of the Church." End quote. Thus, Ratzinger's assertion in saying that the 1962 Missale Romanum was never abrogated could well be interpreted along the same lines as Sanchez, Gill, and Hunwick, that the Missal of the extraordinary form forms an important theological, ecclesiastical, historical, and liturgical monument within the Catholic theological and doctrinal tradition. In this way, then, the history of the sacred liturgy is taken to be continuous with the Second Vatican Council and the rites as they existed just prior to and indeed during their convocation. It's for this reason that William Johnston, a recent commentator on Summorum Pontificum, argued, "In this way, he opened the door to affirming that the continuity of liturgical history remained unbroken, at least in a certain technical and juridical sense. It could also serve for him grounds for his affirmation that there is no rupture in the history of the liturgy and no contradiction between one and the other edition of the Roman Missal." End quote. An interesting further question might be, would the Breviarium Romanum, Pontificale Romanum, and Rituale Romanum fall into the category of non-abrogation as well? I think that a plausible argument based upon the above described reasoning of these authors could very well be made. Two other important authors, Alberto Soria Jimenez and Nicola Bucks, argue in a similar manner comparable to Hunwick and Sanchez Gill. The former, Soria Jimenez, understands the non-abrogation of the traditional missal in the following way. He goes on to state, "Canons 20 and 21 of the Code of Canon Law should not apply to both missals because neither its enactment is comparable to the release of a new train schedule, which cannot remain in force once the new is published, as it came to be said, nor are two legal codes successive on the same subject, which would be unworkable were they simultaneously in force. Given the rules of the Vatican Secret Archives, as described in Pastor Bonus number 187, there remains inaccessible the full text of a response from the Secretary of State, dated June 10, 1974, which is only known in an indirect quotation by Archbishop Bonini in his memoirs, where he alluded to an odious act against the liturgical tradition, a phrase reflecting the classical canonical mentality of the author of the answer." End quote. This response from the Vatican Secretariat of State in 1974 has been argued during the past 4 to 5 decades for the non-abrogation of the previous missal. Nicola Buck states, and I quote, "Archbishop Annibale Bonini, whom Paul VI put in charge of the post-conciliar liturgical reform, wanted to obtain an explicit ruling to the effect that the Novus Ordo Missae of 1970 abrogates the Old Mass so the latter would be suppressed de jure in terms of law. To apply for such a ruling to the Pontifical Commission for the Interpretation of Conciliar Documents, he needed permission from the Cardinal Secretary of State. On June 10, 1974, the Secretary of State refused to give the requested permission on the grounds that such an attempt would be seen as casting odium on the liturgical tradition." End quote. In a sense, it could be argued that Pope Benedict XVI is asserting the veracity of this response of the Secretary of State. At the same time, though, it can also be judged that Chad Glendinning was right in stating that Benedict XVI used canonical terminology in a creative way. Not so much imprecise, but rather something that was theologically juridical. That is to say, recognizing the theological import of this matter, the text of the extraordinary form or traditional Mass, which innately bears a canonical structure for its usage. Such understanding of this concept of non-abrogation forms a helpful way of understanding and classifying and analyzing any legislation which has come forward since then for the liturgical books of this liturgical form as they existed between 1962 and the present day. I'd also like to add at this point some insights given by a very famous commentator on matters concerning the traditional rite, and that's the late Monsignor Ignacio Barrero, who himself was a trained jurist and doctor of theology. He offered a very instructive and comprehensive key to interpreting some of these statements. He argued, and I quote, "The opinion had been advanced that all the laws of the Church that regulated the use of the Missal and the sacraments in 1962 had been derogated, and that the revival of the 1962 Missal does not automatically revive these legal norms. The shocking consequence of this interpretation is that also things like altar girls and the reception of communion in the hand would have been a legal possibility in using this Missal. We should note that even without this instruction, that the position would be clearly erroneous." In a recent letter of May 19, 2011, the secretary of the then in existence Ecclesia Dei Commission explained to a faithful in England that the circular letter of the Congregation for Divine Worship in 1994 permitting female altar servers would not apply to the extraordinary form. And by similar logic, then communion in the hand or kneeling being mandated for communion would be mandated, and that female readers would also not be permitted. And I end quote on that. Ignacio Barrero elucidates 6 important hermeneutical points which will be helpful in distinguishing those norms which support and ally themselves with the traditional Mass. First, he states, in the motu proprio, we do not have a revival of a previous rite which has been derogated, but on the contrary, due to the explicit, legally binding declaration contained in Article 1 of this law, in Summorum Pontificum, we have the very strong affirmation that the traditional Missal of 1962 had never been abrogated. As a consequence, all the norms that regulate the way in which it should be used are now in force. The contrary opinion is not reasonable because it would mean that the Missal would be in existence without the necessary support of all of the norms which regulate its use. It's tantamount to affirming that this Missal exists in a legal vacuum. It's abhorrent to any sane legal interpretation of any law to postulate that something should live in this sort of state. He goes on. Second, we have to consider the basic principle of legal interpretation that states that whoever wishes the principle also desires what is accessory. So if the supreme legislator of the Church has decreed that the Missal of 1962 has never been derogated or abrogated, he is also stating explicitly that all the norms that regulated that Missal were not derogated either. Third, he states, this law, like any other law of the Church, has to be interpreted in accordance with the hermeneutical continuity. In accordance with this interpretative criterion, it is evident that the laws that accompany the traditional Missal should guide its way now in the present. To propose, for instance, that it would be legally possible to have female altar servers or communion in the hand when using the Missal of 1962 would be a case of discontinuity. While it's agreed, and this is my own aside, that there should be a continuity between the 1962 books and also that which the practice is in existence in the Church today, there is also a need to harmonize the traditional rite with current disciplinary norms according to the laws in effect, the Ius Vigens, which would mainly regulate basic disciplinary norms connected to celebration. Very, very basic norms. Fourth, Barrero goes on to state that we must interpret this law like any other with a spirit of coherence. It's co-natural with the Missal of 1962 that it is highly regulated in such a way that the celebrant of this Mass is always guided by precise and concrete norms, that nothing is left to the spirit of invention of the celebrant. Fifthly, the legal apparatus that supported the 1962 Missal to say that it has been derogated is against the spirit of that motu proprio Summorum Pontificum. But also, sixthly and finally, he says that any erroneous interpretations that have been outlined above would be detrimental to one of the purposes of this law, which would be to obtain a healing of the divisions which sadly affect the church in our times. It's evident that these interpretations would not be accepted by different persons or groups like the Society of St. Pius X, who are on their way to a full legal recognition of their status within the church. Some remarks on these comments are in order. While it would be difficult on the basis of the 1983 Code, Canon number 6, to resurrect all norms connected to the 1962 Missal, it is necessary, however, as canonists to offer a benign and helpful interpretation of norms toward those faithful to whom the motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, was directed. A nuanced and careful consideration of all of the laws surrounding the traditional Missal and quo primum is, of course, always going to be very helpful. This brings us to the important topic at hand, which is Traditionis Custodes, the Responsa Dubia, and the Rescriptum ex Audientia. Firstly, the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes of Pope Francis, dated July 16, 2021, struck the Catholic Church and even many in the world as being very harsh and cruel, to say the least. As a restrictive decree, this present motu proprio should be interpreted in very strict fashion, in accordance with the legal maxim in Regula Juris number 15, odiosa restringenda favorabilia amplificanda. That is to say, odious laws are to be interpreted restrictively, and favorable laws are to be interpreted extensively. It's worthwhile to indicate what this motu proprio does not place restrictions on. No mention is made whatsoever of the preconcilia breviarium Romanum, pontificale Romanum, or rituale Romanum. No express abrogation is made of any notable document concerning the traditional Roman Missal, and such abrogation should not therefore be implied. The traditional Missal remains as it always was, never abrogated. The rights established by quo primum are rights which ultimately stem from divine law. Some commentators recently have even gone on to say that they would assert that given the theological implications of quo primum, it is essentially a decree, the decree of St. Pius V, touching upon the divine law itself, as it impacts the theological and liturgical tradition of the Western rites and their memorial custom as well. No mention is made in Traditionis Custodes of the traditional rites of the various religious communities, the Dominicans, the Carmelites, Premonstratensians, etc., or those of the ancient sees like Milan or Lyon. There is no indication of the right of any priest to celebrate privately according to the 1962 Missal is in any way infringed. I'd like to comment a little bit on Article 3. It's worthwhile to note that the provisions of Article 3 in Traditionis Custodes refer to the Missal antecedent to the Reform of 1970. Strictly understood, this Missal antecedent to the Reform of 1970 is the Editio Typica of 1965, with the alterations of Tres Ave Annos of May 4th, 1967. This is not the traditional 1962 Missal. To this author's knowledge, the 1965 Missal is used hardly, if ever. Article 3, number 2, notes that the bishop of the diocese is to designate one or more locations where faithful adherents of these groups, which celebrate according to the Missal antecedent to the Reform of 1970, again that of 1965, may gather for the Eucharistic celebration, not taking place in the parochial churches, and not erecting new personal parishes. This remains unclear legally, as it could be merely implied that a restriction placed upon the 1965 Editio Typica. None of the subsequent documents have addressed this point. While the text indicates that these groups may not gather in the parochial churches and without the erection of new personal parishes, there remain any number of other locations where celebrations can and do take place. Furthermore, some bishops have simply decided to offer and opt for a different grouping of churches into new parishes and designating churches where the traditional Mass is kept as simply either mission churches, shrines, or oratories. While the final article of Traditionis Custodes appears rather sweeping in its abrogation of previous norms, instructions, permissions, and customs that do not conform to the provisions of the present motu proprio, it should be reiterated that the provisions of Traditionis Custodes are restrictions which demand strict interpretation. Part 2. On December 18, 2021, the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments issued a rather peculiar document, a responsa ad dubia regarding the July 16 vote proprio Traditionis Custodes. At the outset, some formal considerations on this document must be stressed. The main lines of the competencies of the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments can be found as sketched historically in Pastor Bonus, as well as Predicate Evangelium number 93, where it's stated that the Dicastery is responsible for the regulation and discipline of the sacred liturgy with regard to the use permitted according to the established norms of liturgical books in use prior to the reform of the Second Vatican Council. One can only presume that this includes the legislation found in Quo Primum, which guarantees the right, very, very clearly, of all priests to use this missal without any scruple of conscience or fear of ecclesiastical penalty or retribution. This dicastery, it must be mentioned, does not possess legislative power. As a consequence, it cannot make authoritative interpretations. Responses in particular, this document, are neither general decrees nor instructions, according to Canons 29 through 34. These are not binding executive decisions. While they are official and represent the mind of the congregation, they should be seen as simply that, an expression of the mind of the congregation. Since these responses do not appear to have been approved in forma specifica by the Holy Father, they would not have binding force and only would bind those who pose the dubia. Despite this document being consented to, quote unquote, by the Holy Father, the juridical status of this document is also highly questionable. Some have even stated that this document is vox et praeterea amico, voice and nothing further. Third, the recent rescript of February 21st, 2023 of Cardinal Roche of that same dicastery remains equally somewhat questionable, as it has become, sadly, the weaponization of hierarchical authority against a perennially valid, never abrogated liturgical rite which expresses the perennial faith of the Roman Catholic Church. Those parish churches already offering the traditional Latin Mass should be guided by the perennial canonical principle, pacta servanda sunt. Agreements are to be kept. As a matter of justice, they should be understood in a sense as being grandfathered in. The power of the bishop to dispense is that of ordinary executive power. Those matters which the Holy See reserves to itself must be interpreted strictly, while the diocesan bishop's power to dispense is something interpreted rather broadly. Another proposal, which canonically and practically speaking is somewhat more cumbersome, is to consider the retitling of parish churches dedicated to the traditional Mass as oratories or shrines in accordance with Canons 1223 to 1229 and 1230 to 1234 respectively. It would also be possible to effect a canonical union in such a way that these churches could merely be mission churches of a neighboring parish. Such would involve the normal canonical processes, but it would indeed be more difficult and less appealing than the simple invocation of Canon 87 by the diocesan bishop to dispense from the prohibition against celebration in parochial churches. A canonist from England, Pius Collins of the Norbertine Order, in his correspondence with this speaker, has cogently argued for a restrictive interpretation of these new norms. He says, referring to Traditionis Custodes Article 3, it concerns a new provision that the bishop can designate specific locations and times for priests to celebrate Mass according to the Missal of 1962 for certain groups, and further that such designated locations cannot be parochial churches. The Apostolic Letter does not, however, state that the Missal of 1962 can only be celebrated in such designated locations. Furthermore, he says, existing personal parishes still retain their rights to exist and carry out the sacred liturgy. It's a reductio ad absurdum to state that if this provision bans the Missal of 1962 from being used in parochial churches, full stop, it would also logically include the parochial churches which were already set up for faithful adherents of groups celebrating according to that Missal, which is nonsensical. It's instructive to refer to the issues that the Holy See reserves to itself in terms of dispensations from diocesan bishops. Those matters are priestly celibacy, Canon 291, the obligation to associate with at least two other consecrating bishops at an episcopal ordination, Canon 1014, the age required for the presbyterate and diaconate when the time would be more than 1 year, Canon 1031, the irregularities and impediments to receive the sacred orders foreseen in Canon 1047, excuse me, and matrimonial impediments of order, Canon 1087, of a public perpetual vow of chastity in a religious institute of pontifical right, Canon 1088, and also that of crime, Canon 1078, paragraph 2. That such a matter as the usage of the centuries-old Roman rite, an acquired right of the priests and faithful, continually guaranteed by quo primum, be subject to such stricture, can easily be considered a violation of the natural law principle of proportionality. Beyond the futility of attempting to ban the classical text of the Roman rite by brute force, the texts, as Father John Hunwick notes, have an auctoritas, an authority, which stems from their theological value, and thus cannot be suddenly revoked at by legal fiat. The theology of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the writings of St. John of the Cross, or of St. Therese of Lisieux, the art of the great cathedrals, all of these monuments of the Catholic heritage cannot simply be revoked at will, a fortiori by those who do not possess legislative powers. Such sheer force of will cannot ban sacred texts and prayers, which have formed minds and wills unto sanctity for many generations. The repetition of the sophism that the traditional books of the Roman rite have been, quote-unquote, abrogated, represents nothing more than simply an act of revisionist history on the part of those who may have some sway in the church at the moment, particularly perhaps those of the liturgists of the University of St. Anselmo of Rome, who are decided partisans of the most extreme aspects of the conciliar revisions. Pope Benedict XVI's statements on a community calling itself into question by outlawing its heretofore most prized possession are very positive. By sleight of hand, the congregation attempts to promote the falsehood that the faithful do not have a right to the traditional liturgy, by the restrictions that are attempted to be placed upon by nation. The supreme law of the Church is and always will be the sanctification and salvation of souls. If a priest must celebrate more than one Mass on a given day for pastoral necessity, so be it. The traditional rites remain that patrimony of us all. This patrimony is theological. It is based upon the divine law as codified by St. Pius V. The basic and essential right of the laity, which is namely to receive spiritual goods from the clergy, includes the ecological and liturgical traditions of the past 2,000 years. If today, for instance, it seems evident that the proclaimed reservation of the law regarding the granting of licenses to celebrate the traditional Mass and indications of these modalities for the celebration of Mass remains in open contrast to what has already been established, to which paradoxically it seems to give some kind of implementation of some sort of existing rights which have already been guaranteed since 1570 AD. But also, too, if one reads in this rescript where it states, the most recent one of February of this year, should a diocesan bishop have granted dispensations in the cases mentioned above, he is obliged to inform the dicastery for divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments which will evaluate the individual cases. One is taken aback by an obvious controlling will, which not only breaks the principle of the law, whereby the law disposes for the future and the retroactivity of the norm is something exceptional. I refer you there to Canon 9 of the Code of Canon Law. But also because it casts doubt upon the choices already made by individual bishops in exercising their authority, which has been asserted to them not only through the perennial tradition of the Church, but even more importantly recognized by the Second Vatican Council. I hope, through these remarks that I've delivered today, to impress upon one and all the essential nature of familiarizing oneself with the important decree Quo Primum Tempore, which is now available even in English translation on the internet, and also its parallel bull from the same St. Pius V, Quota Nobis. It's located in the Praenotanda of the traditional Breviarium Romanum. Canonists of far greater stature than myself have been pointing to these most important documents for years as a perennial guarantee of the rights of all the faithful, clergy and laity alike, to pray in union with the immemorial Roman rite of the Church. Our rights to the Catholic faith in all its expressions do not depend on any authority of any hierarch, although we always are called to be loyal to the same hierarchy in all things that do not involve sin or do not violate natural or revealed truth. I recommend the usage of things like initiatives like the Divinum Officium website, which I've managed with great gratitude for the past 11 years, using media that we may have at our disposal in a discreet way to communicate about locations for the traditional Mass. If we must celebrate low masses in rented halls, as was done in recent history in the 1970s or 80s, so be it, as did our ancestors in the catacombs, the mass rocks of Ireland, the requisite houses of England, the fields of the Vendée. Education is, of course, very critical for all of us. It's the antidote to the confusion that has been poured out into our homes through the media, particularly over the last decades, and it seems like even more so with a vengeance during these moments. We have to always be informed upon the laws and the teachings of our faith. They will be our guidestone. But also, coupled with our natural efforts in order to preserve and promote and protect the traditional Mass and our traditional faith, we also have to as well acknowledge our supernatural remedies as well, which must accompany these efforts. Prayer and fasting are, of course, very, very important. We always must look to the natural and the supernatural levels to find the appropriate solution. As St. Thomas Aquinas reminds us, grace always builds upon nature. With these remarks, then, I wish to thank you very, very much for your kind attention this afternoon, and I'm very happy to open up the floor to any questions at this time. Thank you so much for your time.
There will be a quiz. But not today. As I mentioned before, this video will be posted on our website eventually. We don't do it immediately because we'd much rather have people come out to the luncheons because they want to meet and greet and so forth. But it will get on the website, and we'll have some kind of a device to slow down the speech a little bit.
I'm sorry. Back in 40 minutes, though.
Well, it was rich in substance, I know that. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to have to rewatch this several times.
Get in line, pal.
So is like Pope Francis, is he like violating canon law by saying that, like, well, you can't have that in Mass anymore? I mean, and then what are the consequences when the Pope violates canon law?
Well, let's take the last question as a hypothetical. Rather than,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, I think you touch upon a very important point, and I think that, for a long time, we have not really understood what, for instance, the First Vatican Council has understood in terms of what the restrictions are upon the legal authority of the Holy Father. And that is really to preserve and to protect and to further in a good sense, in the sense of furthering, to promulgate and promote the deposit of faith and the traditions of our Catholic faith. That we often, I think in the past maybe century and a half, I think we've looked to the Holy Father simply from his perspective in terms of the supreme legislator, which of course is a very important aspect as well. However, we have to remember too that the Holy Father could not simply come out and say tomorrow that the sky is purple or the moon is made of green cheese. We would be no obligation to accept what the Holy Father says in this regard, if he were to say something like that. I think in terms of the substance of what we're discussing today, what is very important is to remember that what Quo Primum says about the traditional Mass, that foundational document which guarantees us the right to the traditional Mass, is a matter of divine law. Divine law is something that even the Holy Father cannot touch. So in a sense, it's almost an issue which is somewhat even above his pay grade. And that over time, historically, that the legislation that has surrounded, how we know what actually impacts matters of divine law are, that's been clarified. It's sort of like a projection screen coming into focus as time goes on. And the Holy Fathers and the councils of the Church have played a very important role in that. And over time, there has been simply more clarity that's been, brought to that and brought to bear upon that. Unfortunately, now in the last 50 to 60 years or so, the ambiguity that has come in some of the documents of the Church has not served very well in that perspective, and it has brought a lot of confusion and a lot of misunderstandings. And that's why, as I say, I think education is such an important role that we have to all, we all have to shoulder that burden, I think, right now, to be aware of and educated upon what these realities are in the Church and what historically our faith has always taught.
I'll just put in we'll get to more questions. I'll just put in a quick plug for our July Luncheon, we're having Eric Sammons, the editor of Crisis Magazine, speak on the very issue of our leadership and what we need to do in terms of elevating the good ones and maybe injecting backbones in the not so good ones. Eric Sammons, the editor of Crisis Magazine in July. Any other questions? I know there's several. Yes, go ahead.
Father, I think at one point in your presentation you were mentioning within the Roman Rite in different countries there were either other rites or maybe variations of the Roman Rite, you know, that were always understood to be legitimate. Correct. So, with respect to what's happening now with Novus Ordo and the extraordinary form, were you making a parallel there between the extraordinary form as it's now understood as a legitimate expression, you know, comparable to those previous ones in history, you know, as part of the it can't be abrogated, you know, argument that you're making? And then just a quick follow-up on that is, so what about the Novus Ordo now? I mean, is there two Roman rites, or is there one, and one of them is a subset of the other?
Okay. Well, you bring up some very, very interesting points, and I'll try to address that as best as I can. I think my point there, in terms of mentioning, you know, the other parallel rites that existed within the Western Church, I simply do bring forth the point that even the Roman Rite has never been very monolithic, as much as even St. Pius V wanted it to be. He gave permission for any rite that had been in existence in the Catholic Church. For instance, you know, the rite the Dominican Fathers used to use, or and still use in many cases, the Carmelite Fathers, the Norbertines, places like Lyon or Milan. They all had their own rites, and what I was trying to say there is that, you know, that was a very, very good and healthy and positive thing. To say that, you know, they can coexist alongside, you know, the traditional Roman Rite would coexist alongside the revised Roman Rite or Novus Ordo, whatever you'd like to call it, I think that it's simply a reality for the moment. I kind of take the argument that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre wrote to Pope John Paul II in 1980, that despite the reservations that we do have to have in terms of some texts in the Novus Ordo may say that it is a perfectly valid and legitimate rite of the Church. He said so in his letter to the Holy Father dated March 8, 1980. And I don't think we should be, you know, casting aspersions. I think it's a question of, you know, again, the Novus Ordo Missae offers, you know, a number and variety of options which could be taken, you know, exponentially ultimately, whereas, you know, the traditional Mass has obviously very, very regimented, you know, way in which it's celebrated and so forth. So where that will go in the future is anybody's guess. I think that obviously there are some people in the Church today, particularly those in positions of very high authority, who want very much to simply have the Novus Ordo Missae to the exclusion of everything else. Do I think that will ever be the case? I tend to doubt that. You know, just the very fact that we are gathered here today, we have a love for the traditional Mass, that we support, you know, the celebration thereof, and priests who celebrate it and who want to minister to the faithful in that capacity. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I hope that answers somewhat your question. Does that sort of...
Yes, I mean, so would you see the Novus Ordo vis-a-vis the old rite as a subset of that, akin to some of those historical rites that were maybe varied, and, you know, to a certain extent, but were still part of Roman Rite?
I think in a certain sense it could be considered perhaps like a subset, particularly in the sense that one could celebrate the Novus Ordo in a very traditional sort of manner, as one would see at a place like, you know, your own St. John Cantius here in Chicago, you know, which is obviously very edifying, very spiritual, and, you know, very Catholic. You can also see it, you know, celebrated in ways which are not so much. So I think that it really becomes a question more of a lacking in the Novus Ordo of something that perhaps ought to be there in terms of its clarity, its, you know, historical, you know, historical continuity with the past, and its relationship, but also the other traditional rites of the Church. So Perhaps one could say it may be a subset in that sense, but there are many distinctions. I think that it has to be said, and I think that that's a consequence of a lot of the ambiguity that was surrounding its genesis in Sacrosanctum Concilium.
So I had a question about, I guess, not only Novus Ordo, but the new math, or potential new missile.
Yes.
I don't know, I walked out of the room, I don't know if you touched on it, but are you thinking there may be a new missile? Because I'm reading some things that are very troubling.
Right.
I'm reading a book about St. Gallen in Latvia.
Right.
Who ultimately want to get us there.
Right.
To a missile that's essentially the same as a Protestant missile, one world missile.
Right. I would not be surprised. I don't have any concrete evidence in that regard. It would not surprise me that there are some in the church who are trying to agitate for something like that. But you bring up another very interesting point too, is just the fact that, within the church, since the council, in many ways, some in the church have essentially in their over ecumenical thrust, essentially aimed for, the lowest common denominator in Protestantism, rather than, you go into some Protestant churches that are essentially high church, they have communion rails, they receive communion, their quote-unquote communion. I use that obviously in a broad sense, because there's no apostolic succession. And yet they are more respectful, and they have liturgical texts which are essentially ours from the traditional missal, which did not change during the Reformation. I mean, there's quite a lot, in some high church Anglicans and Lutherans. Again, they do not have valid sacraments. I completely understand that. But nevertheless, they kept more of that than we did, which I always find rather perplexing.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Marianne?
I was wondering, and you just brought that comment up, that isn't there any sense of order with the new order masses that the priest could put his personality on the mass and do really essentially whatever he feels like it, whereas when you go to a Latin mass, and we go regularly to the new order mass, and we were raised in the Latin mass. The Latin mass is always the same, even the words and gestures are all written down.
Correct.
I have an encyclical, and I don't know what the name of it is, but it says that no one, not even the priest, may add or subtract or change any words in the Mass. But that's always freely done. It's done all the time now.
I'm well aware of it. I think, unfortunately, when you go to any number of different parishes, I think a lot of it reflects the celebrant, and unfortunately reflects sometimes his educational background in terms of theology, in terms of his own spirituality and so forth. And again, the traditional Mass does not allow any of that. However, you do see, I think nowadays, many, for instance, younger priests, and I'm happy to consider myself one of them, although I'm not young anymore. I turned 40 on Sunday. Nevertheless, who have come to know the traditional Mass and who bring that to their celebrations of, Mass in English, and they'll keep their fingers together, for instance, or do the traditional gestures during the Roman canon, for instance. I know of a parish in my diocese where the priest has he did not have much of a background in Latin, but he's done everything in his parish to make it as traditional as possible in terms of, the Mass celebrated in English. He uses all the traditional gestures, he, has traditional devotions, things of that nature. Despite the parish being built in 1989 and being architecturally less than ideal, nevertheless, he's, done a lot to put a stamp in a good way on the Mass celebrated in Novus Ordo.
And I think that sort of makes the point that
Right.
you can go to different churches all over the suburbs and
Right.
they're tense wondering what they're going to do.
This is just
And
it.
it's like the priest has the right to put impose his personality
Exactly.
in the Mass rather than it being universal Mass of the church.
And a lot of that will, I think, in the future come down to education, educating, if please God someday, we have, greater restoration of the traditional Mass and so forth, priests will need to be educated in, how to celebrate properly and to do things, according to the very clear directions. And unfortunately, this is a consequence, again, of the ambiguities that we have from the conciliar text onwards.
Any other questions?
I think you're maybe asking for a very simple answer to a very complex question. Because you can go to a parish where, the priest will, I know one parish in my diocese where the priest on Easter Sunday, during the homily, had a mobile petting zoo come, and he had small barnyard animals running around the sanctuary. And I had to actually, with the sacristan, who is now a seminarian, we had to actually clean up this was the pastor to whom I was assigned. And we had to clean up the sanctuary, and let me just say, it was not appetizing. It was very bad. You have that, and I would say absolutely, that would be a concrete example of what Archbishop Vigano is saying. On the other hand, you would have a place like St. John Cantius, where things are done traditionally, where you have priests who are dedicated and devoted, who hear confessions regularly, who celebrate the Mass according to the traditions with sacred music, with proper ceremonies and things like that. I think that is more perhaps what Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre would have understood. I mean, because it's more, they have an understanding of what the Mass truly is. It is the sacramental representation of the sacrifice of our Lord on the cross, and by which, its essence is constituted by its, the offertory and the consecration and communion, and, and those things are given due honor and due respect. So, again, I think that, we tend to see things in rather discrete terms, but I think that the reality out there is perhaps a bit more, is more of a continuum, let's just say.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I want to run through our upcoming speakers. On May 12th, we have the author of the new biography of Cardinal George. He had access to a lot of archival information that others have not had, and he advises he was incredibly impressed with what he called the heroic virtue of Cardinal George that we don't really know that much about. So that's going to be the subject of his talk on May 12th. That's Michael Heinlein. On June 9th, you've got Father John Perricone talking about his suggestions for reviving the Eucharistic, or participating in the Eucharistic revival. As you probably heard, the bishops are spending millions of dollars on a program to try to do that, and Father Perricone has some very simple and inexpensive suggestions as to how to do that. I think it'll be a very interesting and fun talk. And then lastly, as I mentioned, July 14th, Eric Sammons, the editor of Crisis Magazine, is going to talk about our Catholic shepherds, sheep in wolf's clothing, ? Many of you, I'm sure, know of Eric Sammons, and I think that also will be, I think all three speakers are going to be great. It's a good example of the variety we have across many disciplines and so forth, all in furtherance of our collective mission. So thank you all for coming, and please spread the word. By the way, we do need support. We need financial support. I keep meaning to mention this. You've been very good, and I don't mean to limit it to the audience here, but we have a donate button on our site, which is very easy to use, and of course, coming to these luncheons is very helpful. But we do need financial support for continuing our mission, so please keep that in mind. Thank you very much. Have a great